Thank you, Stefan. Dennis and I are going to present together now. You can see Dennis. Don't know if you can see me, but here we go. So there's going to be a bit of each of us. We are thrilled to be presenting to Wells this year. So sorry we can't be there in person. I'm very honored to be following this impressive opening framing of COVID and post-COVID issues in education. And to precede Alma Harris, who'll be talking about really important issues in leadership in a COVID and post-COVID world. I am Andy Hargreaves. I am a colleague, friend, and fellow walker of many paths with Dennis Shirley from Boston College, where I am Professor Emeritus. I am also head of the Shanine Center for Change, Engagement and Innovation in Education at the University of Ottawa in Canada, where I now live close to my grandchildren. And it is the land of the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the indigenous Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. So really important to respect the heritage that we all depend on when we develop this kind of work. So over to my colleague and friend Dennis Shirley now.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Stefan, for the honor of inviting Andy and me to present our most recent research from our new book on 5 paths of student engagement. We're very excited to share it. I have only fond memories of especially the last Wells conference that we attended. It was so much fun, and Stefan, in your presentation, I saw many points of connection for themes that Andy and I will be discussing with you. I am standing on the traditional homeland of the Wampanoag people, Native American people here who straddled the eastern coastline and the islands of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard nearby. I am a Dugan faculty fellow and professor at the Lynch School of Education at Boston College. And Andy and I, if all goes well, we'll be hiking on the Appalachian Trail at the end of next week, which is something that we do that helps us to actually think and to write better. Andy, over to you now.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about our new book, 5 Paths of Student Engagement, which is out in June. And we're going to talk about that in the context somewhat of COVID and post-COVID educational issues. Of course, it's obvious to all of us, it's unavoidable, that we've been living in and through the worst pandemic in a century. The last pandemic in 1918, by the way, my grandfather was a victim of what was misnamed the Spanish flu, and nursed back to health in hospital by the only nurse who would stay with him. And her name was Doris. My mother's name is Doris, named after the nurse who saved my grandfather's life in just after World War II during the first pandemic. So pandemics in general mean a lot to me, but the World Health Organization has made it very clear, even before this pandemic, that we will have more pandemics, they will occur more often, and they will occur in different ways in different places, because humans and exotic species are coming into closer and closer contact due to things like population growth, international travel, and critically, deforestation. That is part of a second issue, that is climate change, where Greta Thunberg is speaking today in Italy. There's a global protest around the increasing floods in places like Germany, the fires and the heat in places like Australia, the United States, Southern Europe. So climate change is a huge second issue that runs alongside this pandemic. That relates to a third issue. There's only going to be 5 of these, by the way. That relates to a third issue, which is rampant inequality at a level not seen for half a century. 2 days ago, we had a wonderful global musical event to draw attention to these kinds of crises of climate change and inequality in the world. It was uplifting. It talked about what foundations can do, what governments can do, what every individual can do to raise money and resources to combat these problems and issues. What it didn't talk about at all was the 26 mainly men, white men or Chinese men, and I mean Chinese from China, mainly men who own over 50% of the world's wealth and pay almost no taxation on it. If we could simply raise corporate taxation on these 26 people to pay their fair share, it would inject massive amounts of money into the public sector, including public education, to deal with the inequities that exist there. White privilege is a huge issue globally, but so also is wealth privilege. And it is the rapacious eating up of the world by an uncontrolled form of capitalism that has developed, which is creating the problems of climate change because of neglect of the environment, fermenting these massive inequalities that we see, that takes away money that could go into public sector, public health, public communities, public space, and public education. And of course, there are two other things that result from this convergence. Globally, we are seeing the issues of Black Lives Matter, of racism, of xenophobia, of Brexit. And these things are not disconnected because, as an African proverb says, when the water hole shrinks, when we've only got 50% of the world's wealth left to the rest of us, we all look at each other differently. And therefore, there's more suspicion of the other, of the outsider, of the immigrant, of the indigenous person, of the LGBTQ person, of anyone who is not normal or not us in relation to the dominant populations. And that leads then in turn to the fifth issue, which is the rise of populism in Brazil, in Eastern Europe, in the UK, in the United States, in parts of Canada, and the fragility of democracy. The Economist now ranks only 8% of the world's nations as full democracies. And the United States and the United Kingdom, by the way, are not among them. And the rise of populism is fueled by the racism and xenophobia, underpinned by the mounting inequalities, oblivious to the problems of climate change, and stoked to ever increasing degrees by this fearsome pandemic. What is our educational response to all of this convergence that is not accidental, that is not just a multivariate intersection, but is all part of the same phenomenon? How do we respond in public education? Well, some people's response to the pandemic, quite common globally, is a language of learning loss. Learning loss says we need testing, we need examinations, we need metrics to identify which groups have fallen behind in literacy and maths compared to where they might have been, and to make interventions in order to narrow the gaps with extra instruction, more basic skills, more tutoring, more time after school, and so on. This is a profound mistake. There are, of course, huge inequities. Many children have been severely disadvantaged, but disadvantaged in so many ways other than just how they've fallen behind compared to some arbitrary standard that was defined before this pandemic occurred. We think learning loss is a misstep and a wrong direction, though we should be addressing the existential greater losses and inequities that people have been experiencing. What Dennis and I believe is that one of the main things we should be focusing on now is engagement of our students, engagement of our teachers, re-engagement of those who became disengaged during the pandemic, and engagement for the first time of many of those who were not engaged in the first place. And as Stefan pointed out, actually became more engaged, ironically, during the pandemic when they could learn in other ways. Dennis and I argue in our book that learning is, that engagement is the new frontier of achievement, that it is the lever for learning and the window into well-being. And Dennis will tell you where this work comes from, that like Stefan's preceded the pandemic, but has also helped us think our way through it.
Yes, so colleagues, I'm going to do a screen share for just a minute. And while I'm setting that up, could you please just think for a minute about what you are observing about engagement of your students in your schools and in your systems while I pull this up. Has everyone got that? Stefan, can you see the screen?
I can see it very well.
Okay, super, great. So, one of the things when we're thinking about all of these issues like populism and racism and class inequality and all that is who do we work with when we work with schools? And what kinds of populations do we overlook frequently? So about 10 years ago now, Andy and I had the opportunity to work with remote rural schools in the Pacific Northwest of the US. So think about Alaska, think about states like Idaho, Washington, Oregon, and try not to think of upbeat cities packed with young cosmopolitans like Portland in Oregon or Seattle in Washington. But think of truly remote areas where there used to be mines, where there used to be lumber mills, where there used to be flourishing communities. Andy and I worked in communities and in schools where the educators were desperate for ways to get their students engaged because their students wanted to get out of those communities as quickly as possible. And that working cheek by jowl with educators is what led us to this research and to this new book. Because this is a brief presentation, we can't have time to go over everything, but we do want you to know that one of the first things that we did is we tried to figure out what are some of the major theories of student engagement. So we went back and we studied firsthand resources that help us to distinguish from intrinsic to extrinsic motivations for engagement, which related to some of the young people you were studying, Stefan. We looked at theories of self-realization, like Abraham Maslow's theory of self-actualization, or theories of flow or mastery in learning, or theories that attempted to connect students' values with their expectations of success. So one of the first things we did is we went over all of these theories, and we found that almost all of them were heavily psychological in nature, which meant that it's a little bit hard to conceptualize and work with a dynamic social environment like a school. This then led us into a critique of three myths of engagement that we hear actually all the time from schools. And one of them is that all education needs to be socially relevant. The second one is we just need more technology. Young people are digital natives, so let's give them more technology. And the third myth is that all learning needs to be fun. And so we have a chapter in which we describe what we think is wrong with it. Does all education really need to be socially relevant? Well, we might say yes, or it should be, or it could be. But if you actually pay attention to young people, they're often interested in things like dinosaurs and unicorns and hobbits and muggles. They have intense interests, which we could pay attention to in our schools to help to magnify their engagement. The theme of technology as an addictive tool that has to be used to promote engagement leaves aside forms of engagement like playing musical instruments, building snow forts outside, learning how to swim, many, many different ways of being engaged with the world that do not involve new digital technologies. And if we really want to upset some educators, we say that not all learning needs to be fun. Young people need to learn about the Atlantic slave trade. They need to learn about the Holocaust. They need to learn about climate change. They need to learn about things that are very, very important, but are not necessarily fun. So we look at these theories and we look at these myths around engagement, and then we go into what we identify as 5 enemies of engagement and then 5 paths of engagement. Andy, over to you.
Yeah, so it's what we thanks, Dennis. What really want to emphasize here is the schools that we work with in these isolated communities in the Pacific Northwest have been brought together by another organization, the Northwest Comprehensive Center, to form a network to combat the isolation of the schools and the teachers from each other so that they could build collaboration that would enable them to improve learning and achievement. Our help was to help them build that network. So it's not our network, it's their network, really. And one of the things they did that all networks have to do is to identify what they should focus on. So the teachers understood intuitively the key to learning and the key to achievement, especially for students who live in challenging circumstances, is not resilience, is not grit, is not testing, but it is engagement. And so we went off because we're professors, we're paid to read. It's a wonderful job, however much we complain about it. We went off to do a lot of this reading, first in psychology and then in sociology, about what could help us understand this issue of engagement and disengagement within their schools. So that is essentially how we collaborated with them over a 7 to 8 year period. And first of all, Dennis and I went to the three founding fathers, they are all men, of sociology, who are Max Weber, Emil Durkheim, and Karl Marx from Germany, from England, from France, to see how they could help us with their views of human interaction, understand the forms of engagement and disengagement we're seeing in front of us. And the result of this, and adding two other sets of theories we'll come to in a few minutes, in addition to these, we came up with 5 enemies of disengagement, and they're obverse, which are the forms or the pathways of engagement that will lead out of them. And the first comes from the German social theorist, Max Weber, who didn't invent the concept of bureaucracy, but popularized it in lots of ways. And bureaucracy, Max Weber said, was actually quite helpful. It had neutral procedures. It promoted people according to merit rather than patronage or favoritism. And bureaucracy was largely a good thing, he said, because if we had perfect bureaucracies, we'd have no corruption, we'd have no sexual harassment, we'd have no favoritism. But taken too far, he said, bureaucracies turned into an iron cage that imprisoned people rather than protecting them. And this, we feel today, is one of the biggest enemies of student engagement in what we see in our work, which is particularly the impact of standardized testing and of standardization and prescription in learning and teaching generally, that just sucks the soul, the creativity, and the magic out. It steals the magic from teaching and learning. We've seen this extensively in the literature on the impact of testing. Many people have written about this, Yong Zhao, Diane Ravitch, lots of other people. And we've seen it in schools in Ontario and other places and we've written a lot about this in relation to data. So what is the opposite of this? The opposite is to, when we come out of the pandemic, is not to test kids more so we can have very precise interventions, but that will steal more magic from them and make them regret ever coming back to school, but rather to re-enchant the learning with creativity, magic, Harry Potter, Frozen, all the other things that really fire children's imaginations.
Right. So disenchantment comes from Max Weber, and the theory of disconnection or alienation that we work with comes from Karl Marx, from his economic and philosophical manuscripts. A lot of our young people in our schools feel profoundly alienated. Over half of them in surveys, pre-pandemic surveys, indicated that they were not engaged with their learning. A quarter of those were passively not engaged. A quarter of those were actively disengaged from their learning. So what do these young people want? They want an education with some meaning and some purpose. And in the network that we worked with in the Pacific Northwest, teachers were doing any number of creative things to help their students to find meaning and purpose in their learning. One of our favorites involved a student who was, a teacher who was teaching history through the lens of popular culture, through music, through sports, through entertainment. And the young people found that to be profoundly meaningful because they could share their own lyrics that they cared about with that instructor. There were many other ways in which they were finding ways to help their education to become meaningful for them. And not all of these were very hard. In one classroom, we observed a teacher had selected for students a newspaper article about dangerous toys, things like exploding dolls. And the children found that riotously amusing because they could connect it to their own lives. That was a group of 10 and 11-year-olds that we observed. The next theme is disassociation.
Yeah, so disassociation comes from the work of the French conservative social theorists. So we have a conservative, a liberal, and a radical here, Émile Durkheim. And Émile Durkheim developed this concept of collective consciousness on data which showed that rates of suicide actually varied dramatically between different countries and populations, depending on their levels of social cohesion or senses of belonging. We know with data from the OECD on related to PISA that collected data on student belonging that depending on the country, between a fifth to more than a third of high school students feel isolated and feel no sense of belonging in schools. One of the major problems that students and particularly teenagers have had during the pandemic is being separated from their peers because being an adolescent is very much about developing a sense of who you are, whether you liked, what your purpose is, what your future might be. Your peers are desperately important. And in this sense, the language that we think is mistaken, that evolved early in the pandemic, that learning could take place anytime, anywhere, could take place at school. We could have more home learning, more learning online, more learning on screen, less learning being with each other, ignores the fundamental public necessity that schools are communities that bring children together, not least so that their parents can go to work and that they can support each other. In this way, this combats the isolation that students might also have and develop senses of inclusion that bring different kinds of students together. There are two problems with lack of belonging or with issues of belonging. One is no belonging, the isolated, the different, the excluded. And the other is belonging to people only like yourself. Algorithms that reinforce prejudices as well as preferences are a big part of this. Selection that separates elite schools from other kinds of schools is another way in which we end up associating only with people like us and not with people who are different than us. And so one of the great things we saw in our Education Northwest project was that not only did the teachers connect across our schools, but students connected across schools as well. They're all rural, they're all somewhat isolated, but rural poor means very different things in America. Sometimes it's indigenous, sometimes it's white working class, sometimes it's Mexican migrant laborers, sometimes it's privileged forest rangers working in national parks and so on. So in this way, by connecting with people outside your community, across schools, you develop belonging not only amongst alike people, but also amongst unalike people within society, as well as within your building.
And these kinds of forms of disassociation, disconnection, disenchantment, all lead up to, for our students, a sense of disempowerment in schools. Really, it was one of our teachers, Karen Martin in Alaska, who had a student who said to her one day when she was trying to teach about the suffragette movement in the UK and trying to embolden her students. One student simply said, "I feel very disempowered myself in my school. I don't have opportunities to really change anything here." We found that teachers could, however, through wise curriculum design, come up with some wildly innovative units. So one thing that's happening around the world right now is the use of drones in agriculture. And drones are replacing migrant laborers in many parts of the world. And this is of devastating consequence for rural communities. So a teacher that we worked with in Idaho and her colleagues in her school developed a whole curriculum unit around the use of drones in agriculture and the use of drones and robotics in our society in general. And the students' papers indicated that they found this profoundly empowering. It helped them to develop their own voice. They wrote to local elected officials about it. The elected officials came into their school. They felt deeply empowered by this exercise.
Yeah. What is counterintuitive also about our approach to voice and the theorists we draw upon, particularly Stephen Lukes and his theories of power and his most recent work about different forms of power, is that there are some limits to the voice argument, which sometimes has become a romantic indulgence of aging white men pining for their nostalgic teenage youth that they have left behind. Not every student is a Greta Thunberg. Not every student is a Greta Thunberg waiting to happen. Some students are the ones who are now spreading the pandemic like crazy in bars around the world as coronavirus restrictions lift. Their limbic systems aren't fully working yet. And so we do also need to remember that sometimes the adults are not the evil empire of darkness that students must combat against, but sometimes they are the most responsible person in the world. And so we have to think about where voice has its place and where voice is not everything. But there are other voices that need to be heard as well, including the adult's voice and the teacher's voice. The last one is distraction. And here we draw on the work of writers on technology like Jean Twenge in iGen, Sherry Turkle, who's talked about the impact of technology on senses of belonging, feminist theories of identity and complex and multiple and situated identity. And here is where we really take on the issues of technology. I'll provide one powerful example in a second, where technology can be very positive in terms of developing engagement. Stefan has raised several instances. But technology can also be deeply distracting. Over a third of adolescent girls in the UK constantly enhance images of themselves on Instagram or other platforms because they're ashamed of their appearance as it's seen online by their peers. During the pandemic, young people, particularly very young children, were on screen 300 or 400% more often than national pediatric associations were recommending. Digital addiction is widespread and is actually built based on gambling algorithms that are geared to try and get people to stay on screen, even in things like Minecraft, which my grandson loves, by the way, rather than to leave the screen. We have online bullying, and so we really need to be aware that digital is not the big answer or the best answer or the most important answer that we have now to transforming engagement as we go back into schools. And therefore, my colleagues and I at the University of Ottawa have developed a charter a 10-point charter for ethical technology use. And I'll just mention two provisions of that right now that are very important here. One is unique value proposition. So technology should not be hybrid on 50% of everything we do, but rather we should use technology or conversation or books or glue or sports equipment or science equipment or anything else according to the unique value it offers compared to everything else we have available to us, not simply because it's there. And secondly, we say every school every system, every country, and every technology company with whom we contract should have a clear, transparent policy on ethical technology use in terms of not only flourishing opportunities, but also identifying and managing the risks. The opposite of excessive digital distraction, of being overly enchanted by the technology and the digital opportunities in front of us, is focus and mastery. Mastery is about things being hard, not easy. Going into the Olympics is hard. Climbing a mountain is hard. Doing a PhD is hard. Mastering anything is hard, and you need a lot of focus for that and not to get easily distracted. And one example, just one we draw from our work, is in Alaska. The community was flying in food at great expense from far across the continent. And so the school worked with technology and the students to develop a high-tech aquaponics kit so that they could breed their own fish and grow their own vegetables locally in community. Here is technology combined with meaning and purpose, with creativity and magic, with attachment and belonging, doing it together, involvement with each other and the community on something that's hard and requires intense focus rather than easy, fun, and magnificently but dangerously distracting.
So we hope that you have enjoyed our presentation on 5 paths of engagement. We do say that they are not the 5 paths. You can find other paths that you would want to explore. We feel that we've opened up a whole new way of thinking about engagement that is especially well suited for this time of emerging out of the pandemic. We know we've gone a little bit over our time. Thank you, Stefan, for your forbearance.